welcome everybody. Today's guest on Difficult Conversations is Laurel Ramsey, one of our good volunteers and a member here at Silverton Senior Center. Today she's going to be talking about alternative end-of-life issues. Welcome, Laurel.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm great. I'm really happy for you to be here.
Good. It's interesting. I think Dodie must have mentioned this series to me probably 9 months ago. It was before the world flipped upside down. And she said she was doing an end of life kind of series, Difficult Conversations. And I asked if she was going to do anything on alternative funerals. And she immediately told me I should do it. So that's why I'm here. And I really didn't want to. I've been dithering about it, but I finally decided it was probably not a bad idea to do this. So first of all, I wanted to thank Dodie for doing this because it's, you know, these conversations are really hard for a lot of people, and it's really forward thinking of her to have this series, I think. And truly, end of life is something we're all going to experience. So it's a really good idea to give some thought to it. So what I wanted to start with was talking a little bit about the medical profession and end of life. And on that vein, I would encourage everybody to read the book Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. He's a doctor. He's written this amazing book. He's also written a lot of really amazing articles. I've read a number of his things in the New York Times. And I think the first thing was an article in the New Yorker. And he was discussing the medical profession's difficulty in knowing when to stop, specifically around terminal disease, where they just don't know how to let go. And so they keep pushing with procedures and invasive medicines, and it sometimes isn't the best thing for a patient. I've made a list of resources, and that book is on the list, as well as the article, the New Yorker article. There's a link to that, which is really, really wonderful. So he's talking about letting go. And when I think of that, I think of the language that the medical profession uses for end of life. And it's very warlike. It's fighting and it's battles. And I sometimes think that in the medical profession, they view terminal disease as a war. And the only victory in that war is to keep people breathing. And there's not a lot of thought given to quality of life. And so that's what Dr. Gawande talks about, is quality of life. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with thinking about things alternatively. I'm trying to get people to kind of think a little bit outside that expensive tropical hardwood brass satin-lined box that is kind of what people think of around death. It doesn't have to be the way the doctors say, and it doesn't have to be the way the funeral industry says. Mm-hmm. And you can actually give some thought to this stuff. And so yay for anybody who's watching this series and thinking about this ahead of time, because it's kind of important. So Dr. Gawande, his books and his articles kind of focus on hospice as an alternative to this just continually treating things that are ultimately going to kill you anyway. And I just wanted to say, I thought the segment on hospice was excellent. And I was so happy to see that because I'm just a huge fan of hospice anyway. But it's really important for people to know that many, many people, when they're at the end of life and they choose to go on hospice, which means foregoing additional treatments for whatever it is they have, they often do extremely well. Their lives are often much richer and they're just in better shape because they don't have all this invasive treatment happening. So it's a good thing to remember when that comes up. A hospice can just be pretty amazing because I think the main thing is it's less, and sometimes less is better. My mom, for instance, when she moved into a memory care, she did in the winter, and that next July she fell and broke her hip. And by the time she got back to her memory care, she was in a wheelchair. And every single one of the places she had been, a doctor had given her some kind of pain medicine. So she was on pain medicine and various things. And the upshot of all this was that she started to fail. It was failure to thrive. She just started dropping weight. She wouldn't eat. She was going. And so I immediately got hospice involved. And one of the first things we did was I asked the nurse, could we remove her from all of her medications and just give her pain medicine as required? And she was off of hospice by December. She was just over medicated. And this happens a lot. So do not hesitate to get hospice involved, because sometimes they can really help. And even if they can't actually keep you from dying, they can make your remaining time so much better. I've had a long running interest in end of life things, probably because my poor mom was so averse to anything death related that she would literally jump up and run out of a room if death were mentioned in any serious way. And so I think I kind of decided to just go the other direction and jump into it. As a social worker, I've worked in end of life, I've worked in aging services, and I've worked in hospice. I've kind of embraced the whole death thing. And in addition to that, I also did a kind of a workshop series on the art of death midwifery. Kind of interesting to get that information. But that's kind of where I'm coming from with a lot of this. I've done actual training on a lot of this. And I got involved with that because there's a woman in Portland who does an afterlife awareness conference. And she does these every year. I don't think she did it last year, but I attended one in 2014 in Portland, and it was pretty cool. And this will be the most alternative thing I talk about is the afterlife conference. But for anybody who's interested in afterlife issues, it is really amazing. There are workshops run by spiritual leaders and by neuroscientists and by people who are studying let's see, it used to be called near-death experiences. I think they call it after-death experiences now, people who've died and come back. There are mediums, which is, a lot of woo-woo stuff. It's a really, really interesting thing for anybody who's interested in all things afterlife related. And in that conference, I met the woman who I took the death midwifery course from. So that was really cool. And that link is actually the one that, one of the ones that I have in the information. So the first section of the death midwifery program that I attended was on conscious dying. And that's basically just embracing the concept that, yes, I'm going to die, and figuring out who you are and what you want. How to have this last phase of your life be the way you want it. Because really, dying is just another phase of life. It just happens to be the last one, I guess, as far as I know. So it's really nice to think about not just death, not just funerals, not just what you want to have happen after you die, but what do you want to have happen now that will allow you that peaceful transition when it is time to go. And I don't know, I think a lot of people don't do that. I mean, I don't think most people are as bad as my mother. But my dad, even, who was better with death-related things, when he would talk about them, he would always say, if I die. He would never say, when I die, which is a kind of a huge amount of denial, because we're all going to go there. And one of the best things that I found that I got out of that was this. It's called an Advanced Death Care Directive. And I will say that most funeral homes have a much smaller version of this. It's just a great organizational tool. This one, it starts off with a place so that you list where all of your important papers are. And then you go on to list what you want after death. And it's just really wonderful. This thing is like over 20 pages long. I know most of you are probably familiar with the Advanced Directive for healthcare. And I just want to say, please, if you don't have one, get one. They're critical. You really need to fill one of those things out. these are really great. It's just a really great thing to do. And you can't go through a 20+ page booklet itemizing everything that you want to have put together before you die without spending a lot of time thinking about death, which is very healthy. So I did watch the presentation by Mr. Lloyd from Unger's Funeral Home, and it was a really nice rundown of what we, I think, consider a traditional funeral in this country. That situation where somebody dies and the funeral home comes and takes the body and takes care of the body, and then either buries or cremates it with or without a funeral or memorial service, and with or without the body being embalmed. I was really surprised when I was putting this together that about half of all bodies are still embalmed. I was very surprised it's that high. And I'm guessing that anybody who's watching these topics is not squeamish about death-related issues. So for those of you who are not squeamish, I'm going to recommend a book that was recommended to a class I took when I was in my social work program from a funeral director, and it's called, well, it's Mary Roach is the author, and the book is called Stiff: The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers. It is a really interesting, seriously fun, and sometimes gross book. But I kind of think if you read that book, you might have other thoughts about embalming at the other end of that. So I just want to throw that out there for those of you who aren't too squishy about death-related stuff. In June of last year, my mom suddenly and kind of unexpectedly died. I mean, she was almost 90 and had severe dementia, so unexpected is, kind of relative. But she had been living at a foster home in Woodburn. And when the owner of the home, Janie, called me to tell me that my mom had died suddenly, after that, she called the police, which I guess is required when somebody dies at your house. That's good to know. And at the time I talked to Janie and I explained to her that I wanted to keep my mom there for a couple of days while my husband and I organized getting things put together so we could take her down to Klamath Falls where she was to be buried. And I was really surprised later that night I got a call from a funeral home in Woodburn asking me about picking my mom up. And it really, really threw me. But the police officer had called the funeral home, I know, to be kind. But even me knowing that I didn't want my mom to be taken anywhere, and knowing that I didn't have to have her taken anywhere, even I was really kind of thrown for a minute. I had a moment of, do I have to do this? So I want to make sure that that you all know that you don't have to have a funeral home involved if you don't want to have a funeral home involved. You just simply don't. But when somebody dies, even if you have a plan in place, you're so rattled, and the assumption is so deep that this is the way we do it, that you may have to be super aware and be a little assertive about what it is you really want to do. So I just want to make sure you know that. You don't have to have a funeral home involved. Most of us will. You can actually bury people on your property if you own your property and if the zoning's okay and the state can deem a cemetery there, I guess. So you could do that, but truly most of us are not going to do that. And you certainly can't do a cremation at home. I mean, that is just totally off the table. So we will be involved, but it's kind of important to know that you don't have to any extent beyond that which you want to do. And I want to make sure people know that, because I have read enough stories of people who have wanted to do home funerals and have run up against authority figures telling them they can't, that in fact you can. And Oregon, it's absolutely legal. So just know that. The second part of my death midwifery program dealt with after death care, with preparation of the body and preservation and vigils and that sort of thing. That's really something that you might want to keep in mind. There are a lot of reasons you might want to keep your loved one at home. You know, many cultures, it's standard to take care of the dead. And there are many cultures that have specific requirements on how long you keep somebody at home. So, but for me, I just wasn't ready to let my mom go. And I found the process of caring for my mom's body and sitting with her, which I did for, over a day, extremely healing. It's a really good, it's kind of grounding. I mean, certainly it's not for everyone, but it's a really good way to say goodbye to somebody. To me, it felt like the last nice thing I did for my mom. So I'm not going to go into any detail on home funerals, on any of that stuff, because there's all that information is out there, and I have put the links there. I think specifically the Oregon Funeral Resources and Education link and the Home Funeral Alliance. Anything you need to know about a home funeral will be on one or another of those. You know, there's all kinds of requirements, things you can do. There's how much dry ice, how often to change the dry ice. There's all kinds of information. And in addition to that, there are a lot of people out there who are actually have businesses now, celebrant businesses. And I did put a link for one of the people. There are a lot of people who can guide you through this. It's a business. It will cost something, but it is a nice alternative if anybody's interested in that. So those links are great, and there's no reason for me to, there was really no reason for me to go into the nitty gritty of that. I think it's better to read about it yourself. But another thing I wanted to mention, my mom had lived in Klamath Falls for all but the last 2 years of her life. And so, we had to take her down there. So we transported her down there, my husband and I. And that's the other thing that I want people to understand, is that you have every right to take your loved one and transport that person, from your home to the funeral home, from the hospital to your home, from pretty much anywhere. It is your right to do that. There's absolutely no legal prohibition against that at all. We were advised, because we were going to a different county, that maybe we should have a letter from the doctor just stating what was going on, just in case we got stopped by the police. So we did that. And it's probably not a bad idea, but certainly within a county or around town, it's your right to do that. Nobody can tell you can't do that. I don't know that I'd take a body out of the state without some sort of official, okay, but otherwise, I think you're good. And again, I've read a lot of things where people have wanted to transport a deceased loved one, and they've run into problems. So please know, in Oregon, you're good to do that if you want to. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about alternative burial stuff. Probably everybody by now is aware of green burials. They've become pretty big. I know the first time I looked into green burial sites was maybe 15 years ago. And the only one I could find at that time was in the gorge, I think on the Washington side of the gorge. And right now there are a lot of options. A lot of regular cemeteries are setting aside areas within the cemetery for green burial. So that's become much easier. I've provided a link to the Cornerstone Funeral Services. It's in Boring, and their site had a really, really nice list of all of the green burial sites available in Oregon and Washington. So that's a really easy thing to access. And they also have a lot of green burial resources as well. And basically, green burial is just very simple. You have to be buried in something that's biodegradable so that you go back to the earth. So it can be a simple wood casket. It can be a shroud out of a natural material. But the idea is just to go back to the earth, basically. And if you do any searches on options at this point, there are a lot of really fun options out there for green burial. The most fun one I came across was, and I think it was, there was a design competition, and somebody came up with a burial suit that has mushroom spores sewed into it in specific patterns. And so when you decompose, apparently the idea is the mushrooms filter out any toxins that might be in your body, and then you grow a mushroom field, which I thought was highly entertaining. But there's also all kinds of fun little pods, like little egg-shaped pods that you can either put cremains in, or actually bigger ones that you can put the body in, and then you plant a tree on top of it. When my mom died, we got a white cardboard casket from the Natural Burial Company in Eugene. It's just white cardboard, and they're made specifically so that people can decorate them. My daughter decorated my mom's, which was really nice. And if you're having a home funeral and you have children involved, if the vigil or the funeral is going on and the person is being visited, that it's a good way to include children, to let them decorate the coffin. It's kind of a fun thing. So that's an option. But anything that is not made with any toxic material and is biodegradable will work for a green burial. And burial is still the most common disposition for people who've died. I know the number of people who are being cremated is growing. And there is another alternative, and Mr. Lloyd mentioned that in the section he did. He called it water cremation. It's alkaline hydrolysis. Basically, it's uses water and lye and a little bit of pressure and heat, and it just dissolves the body. You're left with sort of some liquid, and you're left with very porous bones that then get crushed and given back to you the same way, cremains are. And from what I've read about it, there's actually more remains this way than there is with a regular fire cremation. Another option that I came across some years ago, I got invited. It's called Better Place Forests, and it's an organization. I think they now have 5 sites, 2 in California. I can't remember where the other ones are. They just opened one in Minnesota, I think, but they were looking in Portland. They buy up land, I think forested land, and you buy into it and you get a tree and you get a plaque, and then you can have anybody in your family, pets, anybody, you can use that as the place where you put cremains. Anyway, the Better Place Forest, I thought was really a kind of a fun idea, and especially because it's a one-time thing, and then you can have everybody you care about at the same place. So I'm interested in alternative funeral stuff for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it's healthier to be a little more engaged. And again, this is probably because my mom was so not, and it was just painful for her. And I think that's sad for something that is as natural and inevitable as death is, to spend your life dreading it. So I think looking at alternative ways of doing things that get us a little closer to it is maybe helpful for that. I just think it's a little sterile to have a funeral home involved. But it is a little bit of a remove, and I kind of think being closer is sometimes helps you come to grips with things a little easier. But truly, my primary objection to the death industry is the environmental impact. Environmentally, I just think it's a real problem, and it's one of the reasons that I've been I've been leaning personally towards alkaline hydrolysis, because the carbon footprint it's like about 1/10 of what a regular cremation would be. And the last thing I want to talk about is with traditional end of life stuff is the financial impact. Funerals are wildly expensive. When my dad died in 2016, I set out to do the cheapest funeral I could. I truly did. I got the cheapest casket I could, because that was just who my parents were. And still, even doing the very, very minimal, it was over $6,000. And I think $10,000 is the figure that's often used as a typical funeral. And there are just way too many people who cannot afford that. So that's another option. That's another reason to go to some sort of an optional thing. I do know right now that you can get, let's see, you can get a direct cremation in Salem for just under $700. And that's something people might want to keep in mind. And for that, the funeral home will pick up the deceased, take them and have them cremated, and of course return the cremains to you. And I think you also get the death certificates for that. So that's a much better choice for a lot of people. Opening up a grave is expensive, and generally burying is a little more expensive than cremating. So, and I do know that alkaline hydrolysis, because it's so new, is even more expensive. But I do think the expense is something to keep in mind. I think it's very sad if people feel they have to go into debt to bury a loved one. I mean, it's hard out there right now. So anything we can do to make things easier for people. So that's pretty much all I have to say.
Well, thank you. Wow, that's a lot of information. For everybody who's watching, we'll have all of the links that Laurel has mentioned on the website. So thanks, Laurel. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it. And everybody, join us again for another difficult conversation.